What if, like our roads, we could move quickly, but in both directions, uploading and downloading quickly? What if we didn't have to worry about being on the edge of our limits? I suspect there are people in the room whose kids are constantly pushing you, yes, up over that point, and you're wondering whether you're on that fine line. If you watch one more movie, are you going to fall over the edge into that extra charge from your internet service provider? There is a better way, but our internet delivery system needs to change. I'm going to take you back to when I started. So I came to this as somebody who really didn't know anything much about technology. I used the internet. It was dial-up at that point. I talked on the phone a lot as a teenager. But take us back to November 1993, Richmond Hill, so about 10K from here. I was involved in a trial of new technology. Didn't even really know what to call it at that point. But it became what we now think of as high-speed internet or broadband internet. What struck me as I was looking back at the notes from the first meeting I ever went to about this stuff, looking back at the notes to prepare for this talk, was that we were having the same conversation in 1993 about how we might deliver internet, and we haven't really moved on beyond it. So the sorts of things that I'd written down were about whether we might use the standard copper telephone line. This is the side of my house. You've probably got wires like this outside your houses as well. So might we use copper to get our internet service? Might we use our cable television instead? So again, side of my house. This is how I get my internet. Or, and this was a conversation we were having in 1993, might we do something different? Might we not repurpose technologies that were built for something else that can be used for the internet, but might we start anew with something called fiber optic networking? So what we've got here, you can barely see it, that little tiny red dot, the end. It's a piece of glass, and this is built specifically to provide internet service to us. 2014, though, 96% of the wired broadband connections in Canada were still provided using either our copper telephone networks or our cable television networks. We haven't had much progress. So you might say, well, is this a bad thing? I think most of us, if asked, we'd say, yeah, our internet's okay. I'm sure we'd probably be happy if it costs a little bit less, if we didn't have to worry about those limits and things, but by and large, it works. It works all right. So maybe we're all right. Maybe we don't need to worry a whole lot about changing. But what if your internet service were actually designed for the future, not for the past? I think it's pretty well understood among people who've been looking at this for a long time that fiber is the future, that the fiber network to your house, and a new business model, a new way of thinking about the internet, of thinking about it more like a utility, something where you plug it in, you turn it on, it works. You don't worry about the speeds and so on. It's just there. It does what you want to do. There's a real sense that once we get to this point with the fiber and the new bottles, we'll build something that's future-proof. Ideally, building a trench, you'd sometimes need trenches to build fiber. These kids looking in, watching the fiber being built, would be able to use that same technology decades later. Okay, this sounds great. When can I get this? When will fiber be available to me? Unfortunately, in Canada, we're not at the leading edge of this. We're quite far behind other countries where there have been quite aggressive and quite targeted visionary fiber rollouts. We haven't done that on any kind of scale here in Canada. So to get there, one of the things that I believe strongly that we need, that we haven't had, is a stronger vision, a national vision, one that's not just about fast internet, but it's about inclusion, about digital equality, opportunities for innovation, for healthcare, for education, really thinking about what our digital future might look like. Okay, so that sounds great, but do we need this yet? So I've said insert excuse here. There are lots of excuses. People will tell you, well, providers will tell you, I'm offering the service and people aren't buying it yet. People don't seem to want this. There's just not evidence that there's demand. Maybe it's too soon. Maybe we should wait. So perhaps that's true. But what we do know is that predicting the future is really difficult. If you think about technology predictions, and it's fun to look at some of them, to poke holes in them, It's dangerous to make these predictions, but think about things even like color television. I was at a conference last week where somebody from had talked about how the CBC didn't think it was worth doing programming in color because they didn't think people would be willing to pay for color TV. Think about where we are now. There was a time when we didn't have multiple televisions in our house, or we didn't have computers at home. We didn't have the numbers of computers that we have at home. Things like Skype didn't exist, YouTube, Netflix, none of these were out there, and these have all come within a relatively short period of time. So when we say that the technologies that we've got today are good enough, they may be good enough for today, but we don't know what's coming. If you think about the future, if you think about how things change, there was even a time, not that long ago, when a teenager went somewhere new and the first words out of his or her mouth were not, "What's the Wi-Fi password?" So if we think about how things are changing, we don't know what will come. So we don't absolutely know whether this fiber stuff, whether fiber networks are future-proof. But it seems to me that installing a technology that's already proven, that's working, that's being used in other places, is a lot less risky than saying we're not going to be needing much more capacity in future. If you think about what's already in your home, you've probably got smartphones, tablets, laptops, maybe a desktop computer. You've probably got some sort of dongle or something that connects your television set to the internet. You've probably got game consoles. I was at a conference recently where somebody was talking about one of his clients who had 42 different things in the house connected to the internet service. So if we're thinking about moving in that direction, what we have in place may not take us much further into the future. But our companies tell us, well, they can upgrade. There's still an industry, a strong industry, looking at upgrading existing systems. But I wonder if it's like this, if it's like this country road, that yes, you can upgrade, you can patch, you can fill in the potholes, but eventually, ultimately, it's still a country road. Are we getting to this point? Often when I see people, when I see analysts talking about technologies that can make our copper phone networks go faster or our cable television networks go faster, they talk about squeezing out the technology. But is this where we want to be? Do we want to be that very little bit at the end of the toothpaste tube? Is that what we're relying on to take us into the future? Or is there something better? If our future is fiber, why not find ways to bring it on today? Why aren't we encouraging our providers to develop and deliver compelling services and offer them to us in ways that we want to consume them? This isn't brand new technology, so maybe a little hard to see the numbers on the slides here, but there are more than 140 million subscribers using this technology already around the world. Countries like the United Arab Emirates, like Uruguay, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, all kinds of places. We do have people in North America. We have people, there are fiber services in Canada. About 5% of our wired broadband subscribers are using fiber now. In comparison, about 12% of Americans are, and Americans aren't really leading the charge in this regard either, but they're further ahead than we are. What's perhaps more disturbing is that our large Canadian service providers are threatening not to invest in fiber unless they're protected from competition. So you might understand, this is a quote from Twitter, you might understand why Elliot Noss, who's a Canadian who runs some businesses here but also runs internet and mobile phone companies in the US, you might understand why he says, Canadian telecom makes me sad. This is a person who would like to run businesses in this country, who would like to find ways to bring fiber to us, but the current environment makes that pretty difficult. Fiber is the future, so how do we get there? I'm just going to give a couple of examples of different models, different places. This is Chattanooga in Tennessee. It's not a city I've been to, but it's a city that you hear a lot about when people talk about the next generation of fiber, of internet, of cities that have used technology to make a difference. So in this city, they have a fiber optical network, so it's fiber all the way. It's not just a service with fiber optic enabled in the name. It's a fiber optic cable right to the household that's being put there by the electrical company. The electrical company developed this service because it was going to help them improve electrical delivery, make it more reliable, make it more robust. And it's done that, but it's also spurred enormous innovation in the city, because now anybody who wants it can get the absolute best internet service at an incredibly cheap, affordable price. Not only that, the city has used this investment and has used the profits that they're making in selling this service to allow them to focus on an agenda of digital equity, to focus very much on low-income families, on ensuring that they have access to this network affordably, they have the devices and the education to do it. So it's an example of a municipal government and a power company working together to change the environment. Here's something that came across my Twitter stream last night. Moving to Chattanooga to be amongst mountains and gigabit fiber. Going to be designing, programming, making, smiling, dreaming. This is the kind of thing that happens in communities like this. It's drawing people to the communities. So let's go somewhere quite different now. This is Singapore. In 2006, the government of Singapore decided that it wanted its country to be among, if not at the top, among world leaders when it came to information technology. It wanted a vibrant, competitive internet sector. It wanted much better internet access for its citizens, and it decided that it needed to do something to make that happen. So the government decided that it, in partnership with local telecommunication companies, that it would build a network, a fiber optical network, to every house and business in the country. When I took these pictures in 2010, they were partway through the build. They completed it in 2013. When this started, they had 3 high-speed internet providers in the country. They now have 20. The services are much more competitive, and the services on the new fiber network, the network that was built by the government but now is available for any provider to use, the services on that network are cheaper and faster than services on the phone networks or the cable networks, although you could still buy services from those if you wanted. So at this point, you might make the fairly obvious observation that Singapore and Canada aren't really very similar, that building a network to cover all of Singapore, which is a tiny island state, is fundamentally different than building something in Canada. And that's true. But I think what's similar and what can propel us forward in Canada is vision and the need for vision. So if we take the vision in Singapore and look at how it applied, that's something we have to think about. This is a really telling statement that also came across my Twitter feed earlier this week. It was talking about cycling, about building infrastructure for cycling, but saying the argument that your city is not like Amsterdam is invalid. Neither was Amsterdam. It took long, radical effort. So we can look at Singapore and say we're not like Singapore, but we have to think about the steps that we might take to get to a place where we are where we want to be. I want to talk briefly about rural Canadians. Many rural Canadians have to go to the internet. So think about this. I can see some puzzled faces. What does it mean to go to the internet? It means you have to get in your car and drive into town. So I was talking to my uncle this week. He lives about 160 kilometers north of here. I was asking him about this. I wanted to make sure I got it right. And he said, well, we only have to go for fast internet. He said, we only have to go if, when you get there and you click on something on the page and it just loads. Well, that's why I would go to town. So if you think about the fact that we have all sorts of Canadians living in rural Canada where they click on something and it doesn't load, they have to wait. You remember those dial-up tones? That's what they're still working on. This is a real problem. The government is taking action, but it's slow, and I would argue it's not really future-focused. In Sweden, there's a program where they're bringing fiber to villages. Now, they're bringing fiber into communities. If you live out of town, the fiber might come to the front of your road, and you may still have to figure out how to get it from the gate onto your house. You can pay the provider or you can do it yourself. What if we had a Fibre First policy in Canada? It's not going to reach everywhere, but it is possible. Here's one final example. This is Dolphinholme in Lancashire, north of England, rural, beautiful countryside. These are cables, conduits that the local people are putting their own fiber optic cables into. So this was a community or a set of communities where people had been waiting and waiting and waiting for someone, for anyone to come and bring them better broadband service. And they got to a point where they just decided they didn't want to wait anymore. These are people like all of us here in the room. They were not telecommunications engineers. They didn't have any special expertise in building fiber broadband networks. But they had a demand. They had a demand for their community, and they had a vision of how they could make it better. So they figured it out. They raised money locally. They learned, they taught themselves. They had help from some companies along the way, but mainly they taught themselves how to build a fiber optical network. And now they have the fastest broadband in England at an incredibly affordable price. You probably can't see it, but all of these little shovels, and they're tied up outside houses when they connect somebody, and they say JFDI. So the TEDx friendly version of that is just farmers doing it, but JFDI. They've connected more than 1,000 households in their local villages, and they own this network company themselves. So here's my question. What are we waiting for? Why aren't we asking for better services? They're out there, they're possible, they're commercially viable, they're happening elsewhere, but we don't have them. Let's demand more. Let's demand fiber. It is the future. I really strongly believe this. People will tell you, yeah, we don't need to get there yet. But that's the direction we're going. There may be something else that comes further along on the horizon. We don't know, but fiber is here today. It's being used around the world. It's delivering services to communities, to individuals, allowing innovation, allowing entrepreneurship. It's up to us to advocate for change and to articulate a vision for an inclusive, equitable, digital Canada built on fiber networks. Thank you.